Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of Ask an OpenShift Admin. I am Chris Short, executive producer of OpenShift TV and autofocusing cameras. I'm joined by the one and only Andrew Sullivan. Andrew, how are you doing this morning?
In focus and ready to go, I guess.
There we go.
Yeah,
apparently my camera just decided it needed to refocus right as we went live. Good stuff.
Technology is hard.
Yeah. So, you wanted to talk about authentication and authorization. And I think it's good that you point out that it's like the idea behind today is that it's not that hard.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to, yes, authentication authorization is today's topic. And my goal here, and Chris and I were talking about this before the stream went live, is more or less to convey that this is pretty straightforward. I've got some things planned. You'll notice that it's just Chris and I. The first time in a while that we haven't had a guest. So my goal is to just kind of walk through some things. You all, our audience, you're welcome to ask us questions at any time. That's literally why we're here. This is the office hours. So ask questions, ask us to dive into things. If I have the resources, I will go through and try and explore that. But yeah, I want to look at setting up both HTTPD authentication, as well as LDAP with Active Directory. And I chose those two simply because HT password is usually my default because it's just super duper simple. Like it's, basically two commands to add the config into the cluster. And then, LDAP isn't really any harder, Active Directory. You just basically have to have Active Directory, which I normally don't have. I actually set up an Active Directory instance for this. So,
wow.
Yeah, I know. It's gotten dramatically easier. I used Server 2019. The last time I set up the last time I did a domain controller,
like a production one.
Yeah, like Server 2008, maybe Server 2012.
Yeah, 2008. I think it was my last time that I was like maintaining 80 instances or 80. Yeah.
So
I guess, I forget the terminology now. It's been a while.
Yeah, there's no more DC promo. It's all done.
Really? That's awesome.
Yeah, it's all done from the fancy management console. I mean, you can use PowerShell and all of that, but
yeah.
So yeah, it's changed pretty dramatically in the last decade.
Wow, I might have to actually get an AD server running here in the house. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see.
I know. Well, and it's funny because again, you and I were talking before the show of I think a lot of organizations are starting to adopt Azure Active Directory. Kind of goes along with the whole Office Online, Office 365. A lot of folks are adopting the software as a service aspect, and why not offload something else that's just Active Directory is not exciting. Group policies are. RSOP, resultant set of policy is still my favorite tool in all of Windows land, especially as a workstation administrator. Like, why is it doing this? Anyways, yeah, I'm getting distracted.
Anyways.
So yeah, today is or this is an office hours show, which means we encourage you to and want you to ask questions about anything and everything that's on your mind. However, today's topic is authentication authorization. So with that being said, we start off this show talking about some things that are top of mind. And let's see, Waleed, I see your question there. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. I knew Keycloak would come up. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But Chris, I hope you have your thinking cap on, because one of these today is a little bit of it's a conversation that I think that we should have. And this spawned out of an internal question around kind of how do we recommend or how do we position management philosophies, for lack of a better term, around clusters. And more specifically, Red Hat and OpenShift gives multiple options, right? GitOps. GitOps, the concept or the philosophy is basically you, the human, don't do anything directly in the cluster, right? You have YAMLs, you have these things that define what the cluster should look like, and you rely on Argo CD and the GitOps operator to make it look that way. That is in many ways contradictory to the type of experience that, I think many people are used to, right? Of I deploy a cluster, my cluster is, mine, I log into it, right? I administer it, I go in and I edit things and manage things and configure things as needed. Maybe we have some sort of change control process, right? The infamous ITIL for anybody who's worked in and around, especially government. Government loves ITIL.
Yeah.
So, I think it's important to have this conversation around, is there a recommended way? Is there a best way? Is there something that Red Hat recommends, for an OpenShift cluster?
Right.
So, Chris, of course, I would love to have your opinion. Audience, please contribute your opinion as well. But from my perspective, Andrew is very much the Switzerland of these things, right? I take the approach of you do what works best for you. And my response to the Red Hatter who was asking this question was more or less along the lines of, every organization has different skill sets, has different personalities, and those personalities, some of them are big, some of them are small. We're all affected by what I call the burn factor. So how badly were you burned by something in the past, and now you refuse, or how much do you avoid doing that in the future,
Right.
type of thing,
Yeah.
and all of that shapes your willingness, your tolerance for adopting, different things. So OpenShift is flexible enough that you can do multiple of these at the same time, right? You can tell, for example, if you're using GitOps for application deployment, you can have it ignore aspects of cluster configuration. You can temporarily disable it while you figure out, we implemented the fix. Now we need to figure out why that happened. Now we can go back and apply all of that through the GitOps philosophy, so on and so forth. So, Chris, any thoughts?
I mean, like we were talking about, I've been burned by Active Directory more times than I wish to admit. But I am much in the same vein as you, right? Like, it was funny. I worked with John Willis for a while as, like DevOps consultants kind of deal. And we tried to stay away from like specific tooling because it was always like every organization had their thing, right?
Yeah.
And they wanted to use that thing no matter what because it was already in place. They didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So I'm very much in the same vein as you, right? Like the personalities, the talent, the systems you have in place already, like don't reinvent the wheel, utilize them if you can. But in that same vein, I've seen or have worked at companies where it's like, yes, we have a massive AD infrastructure, but for like our web facing applications, everything's authenticated through our GitHub org with, some third party thing like Okta or, one of those types of tools. And that worked well too, right? Like, because integrating AD with a bunch of AWS stuff was really hard. And we eventually did end up putting a AD instance or managed AD instance in AWS and just kind of synced everything up to that from our on-prem data center and then migrated away from that on-prem data center. But yeah, it was cumbersome to use AD not in the cloud, like on-prem with some of our AWS stuff. So we just kind of said, all right, well, how about a GitHub org? And okay, security team, you can manage, who's in that, who's out of that, and the administrative functions of, person leaves company, we had all that automated, right? Like, it was just one of those things where it's like HR did this, that user ID doesn't exist anymore in AD. All right, go remove them from the GitHub org. So, like I said, whatever tool works best for your organization is the right one.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up, philosophies like DevOps, right? And GitOps is the same way, and ChatOps, and all of these other things, right? There's a lot of folks who believe that, like, in order to be successful, I have to adopt this 100%. It's either all GitOps or it's none. It's either all DevOps or it's none. But you know far better than I do that DevOps is this huge spectrum of things, right? And it really comes down to what works best for you. I used to work for a storage vendor, and storage admins, I don't know if you know this, they're kind of known for being stodgy and reluctant to change.
Would know what you're talking
storage admins and DBAs, right?
No, yeah. No offense, and obviously, right?
Yeah, like, and
I get it.
Yeah, well, there's reasons for that. And I used to have
Right.
this conversation all the time of, why is this storage admin reluctant to change, reluctant to do these things? Well, it's because we've all gotten those angry middle of the night emails or phone calls because something broke. Why did it break? Well, because of X or Y or Z. Well, now I'm going to be cautious of, remember that burn factor? I'm going to be cautious of affecting that in the future. So funny enough, I used to blame virtualization for why storage admins are so grumpy. So the rationale is call it 2008.
Right.
Storage arrays were responsible basically only for application data. Right.
Yeah.
I had a physical server in a rack. Yep. It had a fiber channel connection over to the storage array. The only thing on that storage array was whatever the application was using. And then almost overnight, global recession, all of these other things, almost overnight, it was suddenly we're adopting virtualization. And now the storage arrays are responsible for every IOP in the entire data center.
Which is scary.
All of those
As
operating
a storage
systems.
Admin, that is very scary.
And, it takes storage systems, especially the big frame arrays and stuff like that. They have lifespans of 10 plus years. So, suddenly they became responsible for all this. And it's, why is it so slow? Well, storage latency, because we're running, X number of drives at whatever speed. Back in the late 2000s, it was still mostly spinning media.
Yeah, it was all like
if not all spinning media.
Drive.
Yeah. So, they got beat up pretty heavily. And then, sure, a few years down the line, 2012, 13, 14, suddenly hybrid storage became a thing and it got a little easier. 2015, 16, 17 was when all flash started to become a thing. And that was when storage admins finally dug out of that hole. But
yeah, you got your
anyways,
back.
that's my, that's me completely diverting away for a moment. It really comes down to what works best for you, what works best for your organization. Most importantly, what works best for your applications, because that's what is oftentimes, the public face of your company, whatever's making money or creating widgets or, whatever you happen to be responsible for. Okay. We've diatribed enough on that one.
You want to answer a question real quick before we dive into this?
Yeah.
Is it possible to have two clusters with admins for each cluster being unique? I mean, yes, it is in theory, but I probably should have asked for more clarification to this one now that I'm reading it.
Yeah, so right? I see that Sai Krishna. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Is it possible to have two cluster admins for one cluster? So I'm going to interpret that as like, could Chris and I both be cluster admins for a single OpenShift cluster? The answer to that is absolutely yes. And I'll actually show that.
Okay, cool.
Here in a few minutes. Yeah. So yeah, we'll take care of that. And then Waleed, I also see your question about Keycloak. I do want to talk about that a little bit. I don't have a lot of details simply because I'm not a Keycloak expert. But we'll track any of those down. We'll have that conversation. We'll track them down and get those answers for you. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, this one comes up on a semi-regular basis. Let me share my screen. Are you who I want? You are who I want.
Yes. There you go.
All right. The docs. So let's go to... Docs. Where am I going here? So we'll search for graceful because I know that there is a docs page called shutting down a cluster gracefully. So we talked about this a little bit last week. I think it was last week. It just kind of talking about certificates and how bringing back the cluster can sometimes create certificate issues. So you can absolutely shut down a cluster. I do this all the time inside of my lab. I know customers that do it regularly, right? They shut down stuff
for
over
their
the weekend.
Lab environments. Yeah.
Yep. And there is no magic to it. It's literally shut down the guest OS. Don't hard power it off. Let it shut down, normal way.
Yeah.
But
naturally.
Yeah, there's no order to it. Yeah. Turn them all off at the same time, right? Turn off worker nodes and then control plane nodes, right? It doesn't really matter. I always turn everything off at the same time.
Yeah, just loop through them and go.
Yeah, so no magic to it. Shut it down. It'll be fine. When it comes back, It is possible that you could end up in a scenario where it doesn't come back because of things like certificates. So when that happens, you effectively need to just connect and reapprove CSRs. I have shut down and left shut down hundreds of clusters at this point. They've been down anywhere from a few hours to a few months, and I've never not been able to get back a cluster.
Really?
And it's as simple.
Months?
Yes.
Wow.
And it's every time it's been as simple as I need to use the kubeadmin or the kube config file that was created with the cluster that has the system admin, right, credentials, which is the certificate based, right? Connect to the API and basically do an OC get CSR and then approve whatever pending CSRs are there. And you can do like an OC get node. What you'll see is all the nodes in a not ready status. And of course, if you do like an OC get CO, if it responds, because remember, CO is going to be a part of the OpenShift API server, which may or may not come up depending on what certificates have expired. But yeah, it's more or less go through and approve all those CSRs and then give it a few minutes and everything comes back.
Yep.
So
that's how it should be. I've never done it for months though. I don't think I've ever had a cluster live that long.
Yeah. Here's the restarting the cluster gracefully.
Nice.
So yeah, there is some KCSs. Be careful with the KCSs around like restarting things because this process changed. So back in the 4.3 or 4.4 timeframe was when we introduced the automatic certificate renewal process. So prior to, I think it was 4.4, so 4.3 and earlier, you'll find KCSs where it's, you got to connect into the control plane and execute these commands and refresh these certificates and replace these files and, do all these things. None of that's necessary anymore. So just be careful with those. You can always open a support ticket, right? That's literally what support's there for. So if you have a problem, if you have an issue with it coming back up, if it's been shut down for a while, call up the support guys, right? They'll help you with all that stuff. And I know that they do it. That's their thing. Oh man, now how do I move? Oh, there we go. Zoom windows or Zoom bars.
Yeah, no, sorry.
The last thing that I've got, and I know we're taking a little bit longer than normal today. So the last thing I've got is CoreOS versions and OpenShift versions. So if I go to mirror.openshift.com/pub, right, this is where we go and download all of the resources. So for reference, this is actually the site that, like, if you go to cloud.redhat.com/OpenShift and you go and download the install tools, this is where it takes you to. Right. So this is, or if you click the link that says download CoreOS, right, this is the site that it takes you to. I just skipped that process, so I don't have to log in again. So if I come in here and I look at dependencies and I go to CoreOS and we'll go to 4.7, you'll notice that there is 3 releases in here. Latest just points to 4.7.13. So there's 0, 7, and 13. The current stable version of 4.7 is 17, I think, 16, 17. So you notice that these don't align. If I go to 4.6, you'll notice that there's .1 and .8. And I think the current stable version of 4.6 is like 35 or something.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
Yeah. So if I'm installing a new cluster, do these need to match, right? I want to install 4.6.35, but there's only a CoreOS 4.6.8. No. Right? Effectively, what happens is it will install a 4.6.8. The node will pull its machine config, right? And among other things, it will use RPM-OS tree and update that operating system as a part of it. So new clusters, you basically want to use the newest version inside of your Y release. So Y release is the second number. So 4.6 would be the Y. So use whatever the newest one is generally your best bet.
Nice.
Where this gets complicated is existing clusters, especially clusters that have been around for since 4.5.
Right.
And adding new nodes with UPI in particular to a older cluster. So 4.5 and earlier used Ignition version 2. 4.6, we moved to Ignition version 3.0. And then recently, actually with 4.7.13, 14, something like that,
I think, yeah,
we moved to Ignition version 3.2. So in particular, the version 2 to version 3 move broke that, right? I now have to update my, for example, worker.ign. If I am, my cluster was upgraded from 4.5 to 4.6 to 4.7, that worker.ign is still words are hard. Ignition 2.2 based. So I need to update that. Well, there happens to be a handy dandy KCS on exactly that. So we'll paste that in here. It's probably going to ask me to authenticate, which I'm going to skip. So I'll paste that in there.
Thank you.
But yeah, this KCS has a down at the bottom after you authenticate, has just a little short couple of scriptlets that you can run that will pull that Ignition file and then update it to the new spec. And then you just use that to boot your worker nodes. So just be aware if it's an existing cluster, right? So you updated from 4.5 to 6 to 7. You're going to install a new node and you use the 4.7 CoreOS to install it, you'll need to update your Ignition. That being said, in theory, you can continue to use the original CoreOS version. Right. So this is why. So think about it. This is why with IPI, it generally just works.
Right.
So let's say I did a VMware IPI deployment to vSphere. Right. The first thing that it's going to do is it's going to upload the OVA and create what effectively becomes the template virtual machine for all the nodes. So when I created the cluster, it was 4.5 based, right? The OVA is 4.5 based. If I lifecycle that cluster, or if I upgrade that cluster rather, right? So I go into the OpenShift console and say upgrade. When I go to 4.6 and I say upgrade and I go to 4.7, that template was never changed, right? It doesn't reach out to VMware and say, hey, here's a new OVA, right? The cluster doesn't do that. Only the installer does that.
Right.
So when you go with IPI and say scale this machine set, it's going to, at that point, clone that, even though it's a 4.7 cluster, that OVA was 4.5 based. It'll clone that machine, and that is what gets introduced. And machine config operator does the same thing. It updates that operating system to whatever the latest, whatever the version it needs is. So this is why sometimes it's an issue, sometimes it's not an issue. There's no harm, for example, if you go in and replace that 4.5 template virtual machine with one that is 4.7 based. If you create a new machine set and you use a 4.7 OVA, you just need to update the Ignition file that it's using inside of there. And the KCS will walk through all of that stuff. So anyways, just be aware of that. There is KCS posted in the chat here. We'll include that in the blog post, so on and so forth.
Yes, if you're not familiar with this show, Andrew takes all the notes and every little tidbit of information we talk about and does a very quick turnaround of a blog post that gets posted every Friday. So yeah, Andrew does an amazing job with this blog post. So
I don't know that it's quick. Sir. It takes me like 24 hours. Alex Handy, who's the one who manages the blog.
He's the one that makes it quick. Yeah. That's a good point.
I sent it to him and 5 minutes later, he's like, yep, it's ready to be posted.
There you go.
So, all right. Today's topic, authentication authorization.
Yeah.
So let's look at a couple of things. I usually like to, as most people know, I like to start with the docs. And my reason for that is the docs should be our source of truth. They should have most of the things that we need in order to learn about a particular subject. And if they don't, we want to fix that.
Yes.
And we can do that, right? You can open an issue up here. You can reach out.
You can reach out to us. We have friends on the docs team. It's amazing. It's awesome.
Yep. So, and we're happy to, I'm going to use the word harass. We are happy to harass the docs team on behalf of you all, our audience, our customers. So inside of this page, and let me link this in the chat here, we have this understanding authentication underneath the authentication and authorization subtopic. So what I really want to focus on here is these top two sections, users and groups. So inside of OpenShift, there are roughly three types of users, right? Three broad categories. There's a regular user, right? This is just somebody who is connecting in. They're meant to be using it, administering the cluster, deploying applications, right? It's often a human that is behind the scenes here. You're out of focus again, Chris.
Oh my gosh, really?
There is system users, right? And you can see that these are going to be prefaced by system inside of the name there. These are users that are created by the system to do certain tasks or certain things, right? So we have this OpenShift registry system user or this node account, right, type of things inside of there. And then last but not least, we have service accounts. Service accounts are exactly as they sound. They're designed to be machine operated or machine used or application used, not a human backing that. So a classic example of a service account would be when a pod gets instantiated, right, it's using a service account to run underneath that particular context. So we need to give permissions to the service account or create a service account and assign it to that pod in order for it to do the things that it needs to do. The other thing that we want to be aware about is groups. And exactly as the name implies, just as you would expect from any sort of authentication, authorization experience with the groups, it is simply a collection of users. And users can be assigned to one or more group. So by default, there are a few what the documentation calls virtual groups that we need to be aware of. And then we'll look at some kind of user, or in our case, we'll be syncing them with LDAP. So some other groups that can be created for whatever purpose we see fit. So probably the most important one here that I'll talk about is this system authenticated OAuth. Effectively, this is a group that is assigned to any user who is authenticated with the OAuth server inside of OpenShift. Right, so that's the default authentication mechanism. This will be configuring in order to use, in our case, HTTPD as well as LDAP authentication. The system unauthenticated is, as you can see, associated with all unauthenticated users. You could, if you wanted to, right, assign some permissions to an unauthenticated user, right? Maybe I want anybody to be able to come in and see metrics on some service, or I don't know, something like that. It's technically possible. I struggle to come up with any use cases for something like that. So the authenticated, I believe that this would be used if you are using a third party or a non-OAuth authentication mechanism inside of your cluster. So the user would be assigned to that virtual group, and then you can assign default permissions, default things from there. All right, so let's take a look at a cluster.
Cool. Apologize for my camera problems in advance. I think my shirt is throwing it off, to be honest with you. A little reflection coming off the logo.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's weird. It keeps auto-focusing again.
That is strange.
I don't like this.
So I am running an OpenShift 4.8 RC inside of this particular cluster. You happen to notice that this one is actually a single node OpenShift deployment. So if you aren't familiar, you can go to cloud.redhat.com. I don't know why I forgot the URL. So cloud.redhat.com/OpenShift, you can go to install, select the tab for on-prem, and up at the top, there's a thing that says assisted installer. And with the assisted installer, you can deploy a single node instance. So this is running
it right now, actually.
Yeah, and it works
running
great
in the background as we're streaming here.
So if we look at the nodes here, you can see it's just one single node inside of here. Mine happens to be, I think the minimum requirements are 4 vCPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, which is what I'm using here, and it works flawlessly. I haven't had any issues. Nice. So when we think about, and if I browse down here to users, right, I have no users inside of here, right? I have no identity provider configured. I can create users kind of arbitrarily if I so choose. And I can associate permissions with a user ID before that user ID exists. So for example, if I were to go in and say, give the user C short, system admin privileges, even though your name wouldn't show up underneath this until the user account is created, or until you log in essentially the first time through whatever the authentication process is, that permission would be there and associated with you. So how do users get created? Generally speaking, they are created automatically the first time that you authenticate with the system, right? So let's look at what that actually looks like. So I'm going to switch what I'm sharing here. I'm going to see if I can make this work. So let's stop that share, and I'm going to see if I can share a region of the screen so that way I don't have to constantly, I know, I don't have to constantly
very big
flip back and forth. All right, hopefully that's better.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so inside of here is I have things staged to hopefully work for us. So OC get node, we can see I'm connected to my single node OpenShift. And if I do an OC get user, no user, I have no resources, right? No users inside of here. So let's CD into our HTTPD here. So I have an HT password file, right? This is created in the standard way. So HT password -c blah, blah, blah. If I look at that, I have two users, Andrew Sullivan and Andrew. Right. So what I want to do is, in order to configure HTTPD authentication, I need to make sure that it has access to that HT password file. And then I need to tell OAuth, hey, go look at that HT password file whenever somebody tries to authenticate. So I'm going to search for, oops. I should have found this command earlier and I did not. Here we go.
Yeah.
So we have this command. I'll just put that one command on the screen here. OC create secret generic. I'm going to use the name htpass secret. I'm going to use the file. I'm going to give it the name htpassword inside of the secret. I'm going to use the source file in the current directory, also named htpassword. And we're going to create this secret in the OpenShift config namespace. So now if I do an OC get secret, htpass secret, OpenShift config, we can see we have our one secret inside of here, right? Rocket science.
Yeah.
So now let's look at our OAuth file here. So extremely straightforward. All we're doing is configuring OAuth with an identity provider named htpassword of type htpassword and saying, hey, this secret, the one that we just created, has all of your data. So we do an OC apply -f. It'll complain because apply didn't originally create the resource. Thank you very much.
I configured it anyway.
Yeah. So now we want to come back over here and we want to look at our cluster operators. We should see, among other things, the authentication operator will update. Sometimes it takes a few seconds for it to do its thing, but it'll update after a second and it'll become available to us. Now, I just did all of that from the command line. You can do this directly through the GUI.
Yep.
So if you go to global configuration, we search for OAuth. And down here, you see I have this OAuth, this HT password provider configured. I can come in here and I can say, create an HT password authentication provider. And it will, all I do is copy and paste the contents of that HT password file that I just showed, copy and paste them into here and click add and we're done.
Or you can browse and if you have a big file, select it and off you
go.
Yeah.
So either way works equally well. And I hadn't realized that they'd added this into the GUI. I think this is a 4.6 or 4.7 edition.
I think it's a little bit newer.
Yeah. So anyways, one of the simple ways that you can configure that. Now you notice nothing has changed. I'm still logged in as kubeadmin, right? I have no, if I look at the user management here, if I refresh that, right, there's still no users inside of here. But if I log out, instead of just being presented with the login screen, because there's only one login, Instead,
Yay!
I will see which authentication provider do you want to log in with, Kubeadmin or HT password. So at this point, I can
you'd
choose to
also
log in.
have, sorry, if you install Code-Ready Workspaces, there would be a login field
Yep.
for that as well, because it can use a different provider if you
Yep.
wanted. Yeah.
So I'm going to log in with one of my accounts here. Actually, we'll log in with this one. And it allows me to log in, and it gives me the default set of permissions.
Nice. Which is
right.
limited.
Well,
right?
yes-ish. So
Yeah.
you'll notice that I didn't create a user account. We just looked. We saw that there was no user accounts. If I switch back over here, if I now do an OC get user, all of a sudden that user I just logged in with exists.
Hey,
right?
He's there. Yeah. You have no full name though. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. So I am given effectively the default set of permissions. And from inside of here, I have access to various things, right? By default, an authenticated user is given the ability to self-provision their own projects. I can go in here and create a project named test1, and I can hit create, and now I can come in here and I can deploy things as I see fit. It will follow the default project creation template. So if, for example, you have a quota put in place or a limit rate or whatever the default project template happens to be. If you want to change that, we need to effectively remove the authenticated OAuth group from the self-provisioners. So let's paste this documentation link in here, and we'll paste that.
Thank you.
So we have this disabling project self-provisioning. So let's switch over to, I'm going to copy this guy. Let's switch over to our terminal again, and we'll make it easier to read. So you can see here, I have a default group called self-provisioners, which, as the name implies, means that you can provision your own projects and use them, right?
Yeah.
And the group system authenticated OAuth belongs to that role, right? Or is a member of that role. So if I want to disable, if I want to prevent any authenticated user from just coming in and being able to create their own projects, all I need to do is remove this particular config. I'm not going to do it in this one, but just know that it is in the docs here. And the docs walk through precisely how to do that, right? We do a patch on that self-provisioners. We remove that group from inside of there. And then we update, right? Remove ClusterRole from group. We remove system authenticated OAuth from the self-provisioner group, cluster level group. So relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
So what if I want to assign permissions to a user when they authenticate? So remember my OC get user. So remember, there's only one user right now, Andrew. Right. But what if I wanted to?
What if you wanted 2 cluster admins?
And where is it? See, this is what happens when I don't stage all of my commands.
Oh,
I know. Here we go. So OCADM, because we're doing a cluster level permission change, policy, add ClusterRole to, I actually want to add this to a user, cluster admin, Andrew Sullivan. Remember, that's the other user that was defined in our HT password file. So yes, it's going to complain, user Andrew Sullivan was not found. If I do an OC get user, you can see it's still not there. But I can do, right, I can see if I were to look at that ClusterRole. So OC get ClusterRole binding.rbac cluster admin, and I do an OYAML. We can see subjects. Ref, it might not be listed in here as a result of the user not existing yet. But anyways, it will associate that with my particular user. So let's clear that. Let's switch back over to our GUI here. So I'm going to log out as Andrew, and this time I'm going to log in as Andrew Sullivan. So remember, that user doesn't exist yet until now. And you'll notice that the moment I logged in, I am now a full cluster administrator inside of here. And I can see and change and modify and do all the things that I do as an administrator. And I can add users as needed into that particular configuration. So let's say that I want to add Chris as a cluster administrator. All I need to do is come back over here, and I would add your user to the HT password file. I would re-upload that secret, and then you would be able to log in. Now, because that is per user authentication, right, that's kind of a pain to manage, right? We don't necessarily want to do that.
Yeah.
Right. And, essentially every time a new admin joins the team, right, I now have to go into every cluster and give them permissions inside of that cluster. Every time an admin leaves the team, I now have to go into every cluster and remove them from that cluster, and so on and so forth. Not an ideal scenario. You can see, hopefully pretty easily, where I'm going with this, which is using some sort of central authentication authorization mechanism is definitely ideal. So let's look at Active Directory. So first, I'm going to start by, and I know that this is probably going to be a little small. I don't know how to make the Windows, it's RDP. I don't know how to make it bigger because it's just difficult.
Oh, yeah.
I know.
I mean, you can make it bigger within the thing, but
yeah,
I don't know if you can with File Explorer. I don't know.
So my apologies. I know that this is small. I'll use words to try and paint a picture as much as possible. So this is my AD domain. Really, really simple, because this is just kind of a demo. If you look down here in the corner, this is actually an eval. So I'm not really attached to it. So I've got an OU in here for domain users. Inside of there, I just created a few different sub OUs, right? So one for administrators, where we have this user, Andrew Sullivan. We can see that my username here is going to be Andrew Sullivan. And then I have a couple of groups, OpenShift users, OpenShift admins. I have a couple of regular users, user 1 and user 2. You can see I'm ultra creative with these things.
Super creative.
And then I have a service account, creatively named OpenShift-SA. So straightforward. The only other thing to be aware of here, so I have, of these two groups, OpenShift admins, only my account is listed as an OpenShift admin. OpenShift users has user 2 as a member, right? Not user 1, not OpenShift SA. So that's really all we need to care about for the moment inside of Active Directory. So let's go to our LDAP directory here. And there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. So first, I'm going to switch back to our documentation.
So we do have a question real quick. And it's
yeah,
about
please.
The syntax you're using. So frequent viewer, I don't know how to say your name, DMI3MIS. Why not use OC create cluster role binding instead of the old syntax? Is that just user preference, or
it's just a habit of mine? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Easy enough.
So yeah, I'm slow to learn. Among other things,
it's not like you're busy or anything.
Yeah, among other things. So yeah, there's no real reason for me to use one way or the other. I think I was actually just copying the docs in that instance without really thinking about it. So
yeah, probably. Yeah. We like our docs.
Yeah. So I forgot to mention with the HT password, we do have this in the docs here. You can walk through and it shows you step by step. Here's the HT password command to follow. Right, where is it? Yeah, on Windows. Here's creating a secret, right? This should look incredibly familiar. It was literally the command that I just used, right? Creating the HT pass secret, and then adding it into the cluster using the OAuth YAML file. So let's look at this for LDAP. And LDAP is going to be a bit more complex for a couple of different reasons. The biggest one of those is we don't necessarily want everyone in an entire organization to be able to log into our OpenShift clusters.
We would prefer that you didn't configure it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, sure. In my lab, I've got, one user, me, who is, several additional virtual users.
Mhm.
I was recently, there was a customer that we were working with for a bug, which I'll talk about in a moment. They have almost 1 million users in their Active Directory instance, right? So you don't necessarily want everybody to be able to log in, especially if those who you do want to allow to log in, you want them to be able to create and use their own projects, right? Of having a test cluster or a lab cluster where, hey, you want to go test out OpenShift, you want to start containerizing, Kubernetes-izing, I'm going to make up that word, your apps, yeah, go right ahead. Here's how you log in. So LDAP authentication, the big thing that we need to be aware of here is this LDAP URL. This is how we are telling the system how to connect to our, in our instance, Active Directory domain. And then importantly, we want to pay attention to base DN. So basically, where is the root, right? Where am I looking for user accounts? And the filter. So this is if I want to limit those who are allowed to authenticate, what filter do I need to use to do that?
It defaults to object class equals splat. So be careful.
Yeah. So basically anybody who is found inside of this base DN would be allowed to log in.
Yeah.
So let's move back over here and let's look at our ADOAuth file here.
Cool.
I'm going to actually open it in Vim so it's a little easier to see with the syntax highlighting. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ignore these things. These are pretty straightforward. With Active Directory, you just want to make sure to use the SAM account name for both the ID and the preferred username. Preferred username, you can use mail if you want. Basically, that affects what the display name is up in the upper corner.
Okay.
So if we look at, where's my cluster here? So up here where it says A and Sulliv,
yep.
If I were to use mail, for example, it would show my email address or I could use my principal account name, which would show my full name, right? That type of stuff.
Cool.
So bind DN. This is the service account that will be used only to authenticate against the LDAP server, again, Active Directory in this case, to then validate the users. This account doesn't need any permissions inside of OpenShift. It doesn't need to log in. It doesn't need to have nothing. All this is used for is to authenticate against our LDAP server to then validate the user accounts. So definitely encouraged, right? Suggested to use a service account that has effectively no permissions anywhere inside of your Active Directory organization, right? To be able to just do that bind checking. You can see that the password there is just stored in a simple secret inside of here. So mine, you see this insecure true. I set this up in like 20 minutes in my lab.
So you didn't manage the provision certs and all that fun stuff?
So no, I did not create a CA. I did not, no, none of that stuff.
Okay, fair enough. We'll let you slide.
Yeah. So insecure is true. If insecure is set to false, it doesn't matter whether you use LDAP or LDAP-S in the URL here. It will always go to LDAP-S to do cert checking and all that other stuff. If insecure is set to true and use LDAP here, it will use standard unencrypted LDAP on port 389. So the next part of our LDAP URL here, this is the name of the LDAP server you want to connect to. Now you'll note here that I used the name of my domain. And Andrew's opinion, and we don't say this in the docs, I think the docs just say what is the LDAP server that you're connecting to, right? Host and port. And many of the examples show connecting to a specific, server instance. My personal preference is to use the name of the domain. The reason for that is because Active Directory will automatically resolve that to whatever domain controller is at the site that you're on. So let's say that you are creating a generic deployment, right? Maybe you're using GitOps and you're deploying to a dozen sites across the globe, right? Inside of Active Directory, each one of those sites is going to be defined. And each one of those sites is going to have a set of subnets and a set of domain controllers associated with it. So by pointing it at the domain name, it will automatically resolve that to an Active Directory controller that is local to that site or close to that site. If you were to choose, so for example, I've got, you know, one data center here in North Carolina and another one that's in Australia. And I'm not thinking about it, and I deploy my Australia, you know, instance, and it's connecting all the way back here to North Carolina to do that authentication. It's a lot of extra latency, right? Potentially a lot of
I've
extra.
actually seen that problem in organizations before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, my personal preference is to use with Active Directory is to use the domain name here. So that way Active Directory and DNS, which are very closely tied together, can do what they do best and manage themselves. So after that, we've got where to find all of my users. So you can see this is very simply the domain users. All users in the organization are inside of there. But I've got this filter. So this filter, and this is a standard LDAP query, is going to say, so I've got ampersand, which means both of or and. So an object class of user, and then what's inside of this set of parentheses. And inside of this nested set, I have an or condition that says you must be a member of the group OpenShift admins or the group OpenShift users. Now you may be wondering, what is this 12840 blah, 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 blah string? This is basically so that it does tree traversal. So you can use nested groups. So it is important, particularly with Active Directory, where we do a lot of group nesting, right? OU nesting inside of there. So it is important to use that with Active Directory if you happen to be using that. So, okay, let's go ahead and implement this. We'll try using the GUI this time, I think. And I want to copy this guy out. And I know I'm coming up a little short on time here, so we'll get through this as quickly as possible.
Say you got your 8-minute warning, make it 7.
So we'll come down here, we'll go to add, we'll go to LDAP. So we'll name it Active Directory. So our URL here is going to be just like that. So remember, that was the thing that I just explained. Our bind domain, DN, which is the user to do our bind checking, is our service account. Give it that password. Remember I said we want to use the SMA account name here. So the SAM account name. So the name, CN is fine. Mail, right? And I thought there was one other that we wanted to change in here. ID. There we go. We're not using LDAP here. Now, I say that I'll use this. This is probably going to fail or it's going to cause drama, so I might not use this. There is no option to set the insecure equals true.
Yeah.
So let's see
what happens.
LDAP bind secret is there. Okay, so so what's going to happen here? Nope, not LDAP sync. AD OAuth. All right, so what's going to happen here is, remember, I just applied this to that OAuth config. So what I'm going to expect is cluster-o YAML. Right? It replaced my HT password provider. Right, so now it's going to go through, it's going to reconfigure everything. If I don't OC get CO, we can see that it is going through and it's now updating its status. So we'll give that just a moment. In the meantime, one thing that's interesting is, you note I'm still logged in as this user, and it's not going to boot me out. So even though I changed authentication providers, I still have an authenticated session, and it's not going to revalidate that until the session expires. So just be aware of that if you're going through and changing these things. We'll check this guy again just to see. There we go. So now let's log out. And this time you see that I have my lab.lan option. Right? This is my LDAP configuration. And if I log in with my user Andrew Sullivan, I'm going to get a authentication error occurred. All right, we'll try something else then. Which that could be a result of it's still progressing over here.
Yeah, I was about to say.
All right, we'll let that progress. So at this point, notice that this is just authentication.
Mm-hmm.
Can the user access the cluster or not? Not assigning permissions. What if we want to create groups to manage those permissions? So I'm going to very quickly go through this. I actually have all of this typed up in a, and I'll publish it as a gist, and then I'll link that from the blog post that'll come out on Friday. So you'll be able to see all of these things that I'm doing inside of there. So let's look at, so we need to do an LDAP sync in order to synchronize groups and group membership from our Active Directory server in this case. So same as before, right? We're going to synchronize against our cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's not a secure passwords. I know it's just a lab. It's okay. So because I'm using the augmented Active Directory, and because I want to avoid spaces in my group names, I'm going to map a specific CN to an internal OpenShift name, right? Just easier to use something other than space. And then down below that, I'm just providing these kind of, hey, here's where to find users, here's where to find groups, right? And go through and basically synchronize all of those things. And then the other thing that I need, again, because I'm using the augmented, is a group allow list. So again, just saying, hey, I want to use these specific instances. So I have a command here. So OCADM group sync, I'm going to use my group allow list, and I'm going to provide it my sync config. And then if I don't provide the confirm, it'll just do a dry run, and it'll tell me what it's going to do. With the -- confirm, it basically says, okay, we've created these groups. And now you see I have my two groups and the users who are a member of those groups. I don't know why that's still progressing. Well, I'll have to look into that at some other point. Anyways, at this point, it's now relatively simple to go through and assign permissions just like you would expect for those users.
Okay.
So
awesome.
Now I can do my OpenShift admins, and I add ClusterRole to group. And just like that, anybody who is in the OpenShift admins group is now a cluster administrator. Note, however, that these groups are only updated when you go and update them, unless you create either a cron job or you can use, so the COP has very helpfully created a sync operator.
Nice.
So if we come here, the group sync operator, I'll post a link into the chat here. So very simply does exactly what it says it does, synchronizes those groups and their user membership based on a time frame. So I know we're out of time today. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope that this has been beneficial. I hope it's been informative. I haven't been paying attention to chat. My apologies.
No, that's clear. You're good.
Okay. I will address any questions in the blog post. I will also link to the gist that will have all of this information inside of it, inside of that blog post that will come out Friday morning. If you have any questions, if we didn't answer anything here on the stream, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach me at andrew.sullivan@redhat.com or on Twitter at practicalandrew, or Chris is Chris Short on Twitter and short@redhat.com.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah. Last thing, there will be no stream next week. I will be enjoying the week off and relaxing before my kids go back to school. So
well, you do that, and you do
see
that
you all
well,
in 2 weeks.
All right. Take it easy, everybody.